Hi, everyone. Welcome back to First Principles. Today we have a repeat guest, Ashish, and we'll be talking about design thinking method or methods, depending on where the discussion goes. How are you doing, Ashish?
Good. How are you doing?
Very well. Okay, so now it's become a bit of a ritual now, even though you've been here before. Could you just quickly introduce yourself so that we can set the context right?
Yeah. Hey, my name is Ashish Tripathi. I'm a seasoned product manager with 15 plus years in product management. I also have a passion for design thinking. And I use it often in product management. Yeah, I think that's what we'll talk about today is just some of my experiences and methods of approaching design theory when we get into it.
Awesome. Okay, let's dive in then. What is design thinking, or what other method or methods related to it?
Yeah, so design thinking is very similar to design. It has a lot of overlapping aspects of design,
Hmm.
but typically design thinking is a way to think about problems, and it's divided most of the time into five different stages.
Okay.
Those stages are the first one is to empathize. So it's about empathizing with the user base. Then it's to define, where you define the problem that your users might be facing. Then the third one is about ideation. So it's ideate or ideation, and where you come up with different ideas. And then once you come up with different ideas for the ideation section, the next portion is prototyping. So you prototype a couple of the ones out, and then the final stage is testing. So once you have prototypes, you release them in the public and let the people test them out. So I don't think there's different methods of like actual design thinking, but I
Hmm.
do think there's different methods of ideation of each of the stages. So of empathizing, of defining the problem, I'm sorry, of ideation, and of um, uh, prototyping, and of the final of the testing.
Right.
I think none of the methods are necessarily the best method. I think they have applicable the times to be used in different applications. So, like, depending if you're using a greenfield product, then I would suggest certain types. If you're have an existing product or a SaaS product, I sometimes think others make sense. So it really kind of depends on the goal that you're trying to accomplish for the product,
Hmm.
that defines like which methods should be best. I guess I haven't actually thought about like which like clearly define which methods work best for which time periods. But I just in my practice I've used different methods for different ones with varying results.
Okay. So the overall framework stays the same, but then in the five phases, you can use different methods to get to to get to
Yes.
completion. Okay.
Yes.
And so this particular approach, is it applicable almost anywhere, like designing a new bed sheet or designing a new block of flats, versus
Yeah,
designing a new app?
yeah, and that's what. So, I mean, I think most of us actually have an intuitive sense of design thinking
Hmm.
already.
Hmm.
When like have a get together at your house or buy a present for someone, I think you're generally doing design thinking already, but you
Hmm.
may not put it in that same fashion, right? Like, or you may just not break it down into each of the phases, right? So like when you're designing a party or having a get together with someone, or a group of people,
Yeah.
you typically think about, what does this group of people like? What are the what if you're deciding like a dinner party, say like what kind of foods do these friends like? Oh, this friend is vegan and this friend is like doesn't like spicy food, and like the first stage is typically something you'll do when you're designing dinner party.
Mm.
And then the second one is once you kind of understand who they are, at least their eating preferences, then you can start thinking about like, okay, look, that's really where you're defining the problem. Like, oh, this person's vegetarian, and are they actually vegan? Like where they don't have like, so you'll get more clear on the description, right? Like maybe
Yeah.
they're like octo vegetarians. They'll eat eggs, but they won't have anything else. Or they won't eat any animal products. So you really need to start. And how spicy do you want to? Do you just have spice on the, like, let's say someone else has an aversion to spicy, like how spicy did they like? Like do we just accommodate the rest with like some spice on the side, or spice, so that they can adjust the flavor as necessary.
Yeah.
So that's really where you go and define the problem. And then the next part is where your ideation, right? So like, and you kind of, I think, in people in general go into ideation probably a lot faster, and I think as a product manager and as part of kind of design thinking too, it's really important to stay in the definition of the problem first for a vital amount of time,
Mm.
because I think we all jump to ideation like relatively quickly.
Why?
It's in our, I think it's in our nature, right?
Mm.
I know for engineers, it's definitely in our nature to try and solve the problem versus like really understand the problem in a greater detail. And
Right.
I think it's important to spend that time in the definition of the problem, because one, I think when you're looking for definitely if you're working in SaaS, in an existing problem, people will come to you with the solution versus like the actual problem of like what they're trying to solve,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, and I think I've found in my experience that sometimes spending more time and asking why and really understanding what the problem is will help you get to potentially more impactful solutions, right? Like, because they're it's just like, oh well, I want this spreadsheet to enter in like products or something, right? They'll come and say that, right? Like, hey, I want to load this spreadsheet that has product. It's like, well, what are you really trying to do? It's
Mm.
like, oh well, I really want to have 100 products available on the site like tomorrow, right? And it's like, oh, okay, cool. Well, like, that's the actual problem. So maybe there's a way that you can do that faster than the spreadsheet, because sometimes spreadsheets can be gangly, and like which version of the spreadsheet you have, and then you introduce a lot of different things, like potentially having that solution. So anyway, so I think ultimately, like, it's important to stay in that problem space, and really understand the emotions that those people are having when they're facing the problems, and so I think that's really important. Um, but just for the example, so then yeah, so you would ideate. So in the case of the vegan, like, maybe we'll have a couple of vegan dishes or vegetarian dishes once we define, like, oh no, they're strict vegan. So it's like, okay, like, let's make sure that we have some vegan dishes for them. And for the spicy person, maybe you say like, oh well, I'm gonna have spice on the side, hot sauce on the side. And so you would, but maybe you have a couple of ideas, right? Like, so you have a couple of dishes, you have a couple of different spices, then you prototype, and we all probably prototype at a dinner party already, and come up with maybe different dishes or new dishes
Mm.
to, meet everyone's needs, and say like, hey, we'll have these new dishes, and maybe we'll have some different hot sauces, or, like, potluck, you always, that's like the ideal ideation and prototyping. And then the testing, right, is like, how does everybody like the different things that, oh hey, I really liked this hot sauce, or you talk to the person afterwards who's vegan and say like, hey, did you have enough to eat, etc. So I think it like intrinsically we all go through design thinking in our lives. I think the same is true analogy for like buying a present for someone. I think that's another example. Like you may ask them like, like, hey, what do you think of XYZ that you're thinking of getting them? Like and then they'll let you know. Then that's maybe like the form of prototyping, and then ultimately testing out the prototype and figuring out which one to go with. So I think that's really where it kind of boils down to.
So is testing the last stage?
Yes, testing is the last stage. Yeah.
Okay. And then what happens then? I mean, the process is over for design thinking?
Yeah, I mean, well, it can go back in because the testing, depending on the results of like I think it's the testing is not only testing but analyzing the results of the testing. So
Mm,
if you had other prototypes that you potentially wanted to test out, you can think about like whether we include some more prototypes and get some more testing results, or then maybe if it's a, like a complete failure and like nothing is working right, then maybe you go back to the beginning, and like maybe you really didn't understand the users in the way that you thought that you did. Maybe you're not really actually solving the problems that they had from the beginning.
How often are you interacting with the users in this process, or are you at all?
Yeah, yeah, for sure, for sure. So, I mean, ideally, and I think, there's activities as like the design sprint,
Right.
right? And then so in those cases, the ideal in a design sprint is to ideally have the customer in each part of the design and or the design sprint, and then have the user use the prototypes and help with the ideation and help with the testing, like within a couple of days, right?
Mm,
Because the idea with the design sprint is it should only be like 5 to 10 days, right?
right.
Like business days, right? So, so you're trying to get through that cycle very quickly. So through the whole design cycle, design thinking cycle very quickly,
Okay.
in a design sprint is basically you're accelerating all the you're taking the time. So a design like where a design sprint would be different than just design thinking in general
Mm,
is a design sprint is you're trying to allocate time and have enough alignment that you could do all of these things very quickly.
mm.
So you go through the cycles very quickly, and then keep coming back until like you've created a product that's really able to uh, address most of the people's needs.
Is this only valid in in an RFP kind of situation where a specific problem has been no? Okay, but then I'm wondering then why are users like what's the incentive for them to be involved in the process? They're not shareholders, they're probably not going to make the money. They will probably get the product, but they'll have to pay for it. So, I mean, what's their in?
Yeah, I mean, and sometimes you do have to find incentives for them,
Hmm,
right? Like, so in some of the practices for getting the users in, we did like hold like case studies, and we would have like them come in and give them some sort of money to like do the example for us. I've also used like user testing
hmm.
.com to get some feedback on prototypes that have created that way. So yeah, so I think again it depends on the type of product you have. Like if you're in a SaaS product, or I think oftentimes it's really easy to get the users, right? Like because
Hmm.
they will get the benefit of the changes in the product, right? So like if you have a user, but I mean I think there's times even in like when you're just doing internal tools where you'll have a user that's like, oh yeah, like if you're doing an update for customer support, say, right? And they're going to get the benefit of the change. then most likely they'll be like, oh yeah, I'll help you like test this out. I'll take the extra time, and they can get and you can even get the alignment with their bosses too, right? To say like, hey, look, this will be a benefit for you guys because you'll get this, and then they'll be like, oh yeah, yeah, sure, we'll be able to be there,
Okay. So a slightly tangential question, I suppose, but I want to understand this more outside the context of SaaS, and it's okay if you're not comfortable, but I'll throw it out anyway. Well, before the call, we were talking about airlines, right, and service delivery of airlines. Now, if you had to design the service delivery for a new airline, and let's say we want to channel Pan American Airways, they were pretty good. How will you use design thinking in order to design this service for United or Delta or even Frontier or Spirit or
Mhm.
whatever the name is? So how would you start off with these five phases, and how would you basically approach this project?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there's a book that I like, and it's called How to Talk to Humans. The author is escaping me right now, but it talks about this kind of process, right?
Hmm,
Like, so what would you do? And it has elements of design thinking in it as well. But essentially, I would approach it with the same kind of idea of like, you find like first you try to do the activity that you're proposing, right? Like how would you do it today, right? So
right.
like so I think How to Talk to Humans, it's about buying pillows. And so it's saying that the first thing that they do is go to different stores and try to buy pillows, right? And so like so that's the thing. So that's the initial one. The second one is then you try to find people, like, and in that case they would find during their pillow shopping, see who is finding buying pillows, and then go and ask them like, hey, can you ask you about some questions about like how you're buying pillow, right?
Hmm,
I think the one piece that's like a little bit different from and so typically that's like where you'll start is like you'll actually in design thinking, you'll start with defining the field of study. So like you'll start with finding like, so who are the people and where are we going to go to find the users, right, that we're trying to empathize with,
yeah.
right? And so
And why would they
so
be interested? So maybe we'll have to think about
right.
that as well. Right.
Yeah. And so you need to try, and I would say the difference like now in the digital world is also maybe you have analytics, right?
Right.
So if there's something that you're like particularly trying to find, then you could search to see like where are people usually going for this, right? Like you use like analytical tools like Google Trends, or see like SEO, see what people are searching. So that way you can kind of determine like who is it, where are we going, where is this group that we're looking for, where are these users that we're trying to empathize with, and understanding that idea is kind of the first step. Then you can start to really empathize with what they're feeling. So the ways that I start defining the problem is, and again, it can be different depending on how you do it. But in the digital world, I'll start with a customer journey. So I'll say like, what do I do to do that piece, right? And where do I, and as I'm going through the journey, so the first thing is just auditing all the steps. So like, what are all the steps that I have to go through, right?
Right.
Then once all the steps are defined, then I also start to think about where was I feeling different emotions, and I use like Plutarch's wheel of emotions, which is like it's a diagram, and I can share it with you. But it's like it's basically a diagram of different emotions,
Okay.
and they kind of build on each other, right? Like they have the regular five of like anger
Right.
and happiness and joy, but the interesting thing is like they're usually like they're in a way that they're like opposites of each other. So like if somebody is feeling, say, like anxiety, right? Like the opposite would be like anticipation, right? So like so sometimes there are in this can help in the ideation, right? Of like what are you feeling and what would be the opposite emotion of this? Because then you could say like how, sometimes it is, you know, you are able to kind of convert someone, say, from anxiety to anticipation, right? Like, and you probably found this yourself, like if you're looking at, say, DoorDash or something, and like you're watching the driver come to your house, like it can be anticipation, until something goes wrong
Yeah.
in that scenario, and they're like, they've turned left from your house, and then it can really become anxiety at that point.
Yeah.
So like you can try to think of like, okay, well, how do we alleviate that problem? Like, or like as I was going through the app, like this is the anxiety that I felt, right? Like when the order went in the wrong direction, I started feeling this anxiety. So so define all the steps that you're going through, and you don't have to do that only in the digital world, but
Mhm.
usually a customer journey is the way that I do it for the digital world, and it's like look at all the screens, have a layout of all the screens, all the buttons I'm pushing as I go through.
Right.
In the real world, you could probably just write out like all the steps you would do, right? And maybe there's a mix of like media, right? Like maybe part of it's online and part of it's in person. So you
Just
might.
a small interruption here. I think this might be a very useful thing. I mean, I'm pretty sure they already do it, but in like the cockpit, when they're designing the crew relationship management, let's say protocols, what
Yeah.
will give you a high cognitive overload, what can compromise safety, so all of those things. Okay.
Yeah, and yeah, that's good. It's a good point. Yeah, because originally I came from, so all of my design training, because I worked for Boeing. So
Right.
originally my design, like not even design thinking, but just straight design was actually from human factors, and so a lot of that came into account, right? Like what's causing too much cognitive load. What is like actually like, what are you gonna be able to reach like physically, versus and I think some of that still comes to play, especially like in mobile devices, right? Like when you're looking at, you have to think about like how small the screen might be when someone's actually looking at it on their hand, how
Yeah.
big the button's going to be when you actually press it, right? Like so all those kind of details about the design are things that you should start to empathize with as you're going through, because
Okay.
if you're finding it difficult to use, then most likely like your user base is finding it difficult to use. And so yeah, then the other part about that is that if you can use analytics, so like let's say there is already an existing portion in one of these buying, airline tools to
Yeah.
buy, then you could use user analytics there to figure out like where are people spending heat maps to see like where are they spending their time, how many steps is it taking to get to the goal, is there any frustration or time that's being spent, in one area that you're not like particularly thinking about. So I like to use that in conjunction with quantitative surveys of the people that are like trying to use it, right? So like, do a case study, go and find those users, offer them like, $20 gift card or something, or use user testing, then see like how do they use it, what are they doing now, and really interview them to understand like what are their questions. Um, then after you get the results, so in the same way that you're using your emotions, and using Plutarchs and really identifying what emotions you're feeling at the times, you want to do the same with the interview results. So you want to ask the same questions every time you go and interview them, and then you want to, like, I'll usually put a box around or highlight and say like this. I think at this point they're feeling, frustration, or at this point they're feeling anxiety, and so understand like where the user, and it's sort of subjective, right? Like, I think when you have analytics, sometimes you can get a more, objective view of like, oh, this is actually where they're spending the time. I think it's good to make sure that those 2 things kinda match up
Hmm.
and that what they're telling, because this will often happen, is that what people tell you is not, like, how they actually use
Yeah.
the web,
Yeah.
you know? So it's really important to, like, merge your qualitative, insights and test them out with quantitative results, and that this will also serve you later when you're doing prototypes and testing, right? So if you can think about like, okay, well, how can we test this guy's emotions right now as he's going through the flow? That will come to play in the same way once you create a prototype and test. You should get those same kinds of results to see like, oh, are they spending less time going through the app to get to the goal? You know, like when we did a survey, did they seem like they didn't have the same frustration that they had before? You know, those are all kind of things to take into account when you're going to the later part. But again, like so that kind of user analytics and stuff like works better. So in the sense of the methods, I think that works better in an existing product or a SaaS product, right? Because it's easier to get the user and stuff. I mean, you could still do the interviews, but you're usually not going to get like user analytics from like a greenfield product that's never been done before, right? If there's no
Right, right, right. So what do you do there? I mean, is it just intuition?
No, so greenfield products, I think you have to start with the quantitative ones. You can also look at competitors, but it's still way more subjective
Hmm.
than it is necessarily in the in an existing product world. And so you have a little bit more risk. So the way that I would create the ideation and the prototypes that I would create for greenfield are different than the ones that I would do for existing product or SaaS product.
Okay.
Or is not sorry, B2B kind of product would be different than how I would do a brand new product. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I'm thinking here, it's just the empathy part is going to become difficult in a like a 0 to 1 greenfield product, right? Because they don't know what exists or what doesn't exist. You're literally creating something new. So Wright brothers
Yeah,
with like the airplane, what do you do there?
I don't think it's that difficult, right?
Okay.
In the sense, well, I mean, sure, maybe it is like if you're being like very, very disruptive in the industry and like, you know, if you're like creating Uber or something.
Yeah.
But like if you take like a Dyson or something, right? Like vacuuming already existed, right?
Hmm.
There's already some solution that's in place, right? And then there's already competitors to that solution like that are in place. So I don't think it's that difficult to look at the others and see like, okay, well, how many people are using these and how many are using those and like who are we really targeting to be our users, right? Are we trying to get like, you know, like in like, you know, like Figma is a case or something, right? Like who are they actually going for, right? Are they
Hmm.
going for like UX designer? Like so that's it's probably what's their biggest problem, right? And you have to kind of think through like what were the competitors, what are the competitors back then, because I'm sure they thought of that when they created Figma, right? Like who is their target audience, who's their target user.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think in that way too, like design thing is really helpful because it lends itself to the marketing and your go to market as well, right? Because you're really trying to understand who is this user, right? Like
Right.
why do they care about this, right? Like what's the benefit for them? And so that kind of marketing, even if it's B2B or internal, like that can help you throughout getting the whole product done, right? Because you're like, hey, look, this is the day in the life of the person that you know, like when I see like these pitches from like entrepreneurs and stuff, like the ones I typically like gravitate towards are the ones where like, hey, I had this problem and I didn't know how to fix it, and so like this is why I created this thing, right? Because like I didn't have the I didn't know how to solve the problem. Then like that's that, you know, I think that like is already a marketing message, because if you're that person with the same, if you can identify with the person with the same kind of problem, then it's real, you know, it's relatively easy to be like, oh yeah, I can see the value of this, right? Like I understand like why I should do it. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay, so are we discovering the problem in these steps, or are we discovering a solution here?
Yeah. So right now, so the real key is to discover the problems, right?
Okay.
Like, so what is the problem that it is, and then you're really trying to define the problem first, right? So it's like, what is, so once you're going through the user journey, right? You'll say like, where are you finding the most problem, right? Where are you feeling the strongest emotions? Right, and understanding like where are these people finding the biggest problem, like when they're going through, and so it's really understanding that. That's when you move into the definition, right? So that's where you're defining the problem. And so in the definition of the problem, you really want to look at where can you um, find the biggest problem that solves the most of the issues, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
because that's where you'll find like there's, when you talk to enough users, you'll find a confluence of like, hey, the biggest issue is X, right? So like, let's solve X for them. And they'll all typically have the same problem that you're trying to solve for, right? Versus like when you have a bunch of little problems that are like, sometimes it can be hard to determine like, you know, is that really valuable or not to them. So that's
Right.
really where it kind of gets to that point, is where
Right.
you, that's where you define it and clearly define it, that this is the problem and the goal of the problem is you know, X. Like we want to like take, you know, this and change it to this, right? And the bigger the you know the goal is, the better, right? Like define, you know, like if Google, you know, like, you know, make the world's data searchable, you know, like that's like, you know, that's their problem that they're trying to solve. So it's like, so it can, you know, it's something that you can say like, oh yeah, I understand like what we're trying to do here, what we're trying to solve. So
So this is a very sort of active empathy kind of thing, right? Because okay, because you do need to speak to people. Now, are you worried about adverse selection in the sense that people who, like Joe Rogan has this joke, right? Who answers political surveys? I mean, people who have nothing else to do. So,
yeah,
so,
sure.
so similarly, in these scenarios, or people who are more motivated by the $20 Chick-fil-A coupon rather
Sure,
than,
sure.
what do you do
Yeah,
then?
there's selective bias too, right? Like, you know, you want a selection by like, you know, maybe I want to work with the people that, you know, like even if I'm like internally coming up with something, like I want to work with my, you know, my buddies at work, right? Like I don't want to, you know, like but so I think you have to guard against that. I think also if you have the the analytics, the customer analytics, then you can kind of solve for that, right? Because like you know, are you just taking what you already preconceived as like your idea of what you think the problem is, you know, and not really like listening to what they have. But you know, the hope is that understanding the empathy, getting enough interviews, that you're trying to make sure that you can build the story, and have it be validated, and so that's why with a greenfield 0 to 1, I think some of the prototyping and validations you can do beforehand
Mm.
to like make sure that you're not programming before you start spending money to like program something that's not worth it, right? Like
Right.
that's where like, so I guess we can kind of go into that. So like, so for a 0 to 1 in the ideations, um I think it's easier that if you already have a group of people, that the lowest fidelity solution that you can make is one that doesn't exist, right? Like, so really like the idea of pre-selling,
Mm.
and you'll see this all the time, you know, even in regular business. or B2B business is that like you'll be like, hey, would you be interested in something like this, right? That would solve this problem for you. And these are the three tiers. Like, would you pre-buy this, kind of thing, right? For like
And how
30.
much would you pay for this? Because I read
Yeah.
an article on the advanced market commitments for like future tech, and that
Yes,
might
yes.
be a good idea. But like, who are they? Do they have that much of a risk appetite or interest in paying for something like
Exactly,
that?
exactly,
Right.
exactly, right, yeah, and so then you would ask, like, if you would ask them, right? And
Mm,
so, like, again, if this is the same users, you would ask them again, follow up and say, like, "Hey, if you had this solution, would you buy it, and how much would you buy it for?" And then that's really where the prototyping, and that's kind of the difference in the prototyping that I would do, and the testing that I would do in the greenfield versus a real product.
right.
The other side you can do, obviously this is more in vogue lately, is really where you have a product led product, right? So like, so you start for free, but
Mm,
but in those kinds of cases, you have to take into account, right? Like, what am I willing to spend on, and really you can think about it because in some ways a product led product, right? Like, you don't need marketing as much as you would in a previous case, right? Like, so you have to kind of think it through, and have kind of alignment from management that, like, yeah, I'm willing to spend, you know $100,000 to have this be available for users for the next 3 months. And then if we don't get, any users to sign up, or, what is our acceptable rate of growth, right?
mm,
Like, like, because sometimes some startups, some people will have more willingness to, they'll have more money. So like, maybe you don't need to turn a profit right away. Maybe all you're looking for is growth, right? Like, as
right.
long as we grow it by 100,000 users, like, that's enough, right? And I think you have to. That's kind of the difference between the prototypes that you would do in a 0 to 1 versus an existing product. Yeah.
Okay. And you mentioned design sprints. So all these all these five phases, do all of them sort of happen in a sprint, or there are different
Yeah,
sprints?
and
Okay.
so the outcome of design sprint is that all of those things happen within the same, within a short time period. So you try to get all of those things done within 2 weeks, right?
Hmm.
And so you're trying to create prototypes. You're trying to create, so it's low fidelity prototypes, low fidelity user testing, like, and just really have them, like, they don't actually do anything, like, then when you click the buttons, or it's like a PowerPoint presentation animation, right? And it looks like it's working. But like, you let them use it and say, like, hey, how did this go, right? Or
Hmm.
like, have user testing, they go and look and say, like, how did this go? And then that's really where you you try to, reduce the amount of time that it's coming in. But I think in the regular world, like, in the regular, like, if you're not in a design sprint, like, if you're not trying to do a design sprint per se, like, then I think it usually just happens, like, when you're in a regular sprint and you've got the items in your backlog, right? Like, those, it's essentially each one of those stories is a small design thinking endeavor, right?
Yeah.
Like, because each one of them is a prototype, right? So like,
Yeah.
so you've come up with a prototype. If you can do it faster, like, in some cases, like, so the prototyping, so some of the methods, right? Like, if you create an A/B test, sometimes that's the way I would go for, like, an existing product that you're changing slightly. You create an A/B test. That way you can validate it, and you can get, results, like, relatively quickly, to see, like, oh yeah, we were able to make more revenue, or, we were able to reduce the amount of steps that the person was able to do. And so, like, let's this is worth it to spend the money on, and do, like, a full implementation, right? Rather than, like, just an A/B test. Yeah, so.
Double clicking on the A/B test,
Mhm.
correlation isn't causation, right? So how do we avoid that pitfall? because the revenue might have grown for some other reason, but you think it's
Sure.
because moving the cursor from here to there.
Yeah, I mean, usually, you know, if it is revenue, if you're checking the revenue on that like click to action, like you know that call to action. So it's like, so you know, you can see like how many of those did we get versus like the old method. You know, that would typically be it. You know, so you do sometimes there are cases, right, like where you can have correlation, so you have to really look at the results and make sure you're having a statistically significant like shift in like what you're testing, right? Versus like just some sort of like, you know, anomaly that came up, you know. So like you can run it for a couple of weeks or a couple of, you know, until you reach that sample size that gives you that statistic significance. Um, and so that's really where I usually just use a website that tells you how many samples you need to get statistical significance. So then, you know, once we have that, then we will usually just go from that. Like,
Okay.
and then like, yeah, that the A/B test is accurate, and that we've, you know, accomplished like, you know, what the goal was. But you're right. There are where it can get really complicated is when you have like multiple tests on the same page, or multiple tests on the same website. That's when stuff starts getting like really super like can be a little hard to untangle and like and say like so it's really about like test structure and like what are you looking at and like you know, figuring out like is it because we just marketed that page a bunch, you know. So you do have to kind of consider those things,
Hmm.
like, so, like, I wouldn't, you know, Black Friday is probably not the best day to do like an A/B test, you know, like, you know, and so like you kind of have to plan out like when am I going to do the A/B test? Like, what makes sense, you know? So
What are the steps again? Sorry, just for my memory. So empathize, ideate, prototype,
it's empathize, define,
define.
ideate. So define is defining the problem.
Mm.
Ideate is when you come up with the different ideas. And really, yeah, really the methods for ideate. You know, you can usually use like you know, it's not necessarily like brainstorming, but like design sprints is typically where you come together and then you're alone and then you come together again and then
Right.
you're alone.
Mm.
So typically that goes as like,
Caves and commons.
yeah, so you define the problem, you come up with solutions, you know, and you should have been empathizing already too, so you understand what the user is like. Then the ideation will be you'll try and find a confluence like after everyone writes down their ideas,
Mm.
and then you'll maybe think about like considerations for budget, or like what do you want, like which do you think is the actual, you know, solution that might be the best, or like best at like, you know, changing the emotions from like, you know, maybe potentially anxiety to, you know, anticipation.
Mm.
And so uh you can look at all those things when you're ideating, and then that's when you'll figure out like, and then you'll do a similar process for prototyping, and then for the testing. But in prototyping, the main difference that I would have like from 0 to 1 versus like a regular is that you know, definitely pre-sale, you know, and if you're gonna like A/B test your pre, like have different prototypes for the pre-sale, but that wouldn't be like a it wouldn't be like a software A/B test, right? It would just
Right.
be like, okay, here's two different emails, like let's send it out and see which one
Yeah.
you know goes. So
Have you come across? I'm really forgetting the case study, the book, everything. But what stood out, the episode that stood out, was I suppose first responders. Were they generally have an equipment where they can reach somebody or put key in a few important facts, and a new equipment was being made for them, which looked like like a standard smartphone.
mhm.
Now, everybody thought that's a good idea, but once they actually got the users in and asked them to look at the prototype, they hated it because
Sure.
the cognitive load in navigating those buttons on a plain screen, they're much. they preferred the haptic touch. They preferred things to be like real and mechanical.
Sure, sure.
So is now somebody would categorize that as just what's the word? People who Luddites, right? They were not Luddites though, because in that scenario, you do not want so many things coming into you. So have you come across this, and how do you approach it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think there is that, right? And I have come across this um in scenarios where the user is not the same as the purchaser,
Right.
right? Like, and sometimes products are made and not incentivized for the user.
Hmm.
But
Why?
um I mean, so just to, I mean, yeah, like here's a real easy example for something that we like. I used to, I wasn't in the product team for this, but I used to implement. It was like I used to implement a timekeeping system,
Right.
right, for refineries, right?
Hmm.
Um, and it's very easy to incentivize the purchaser of a timekeeping system, right? It's hey, you're losing thousands of dollars because of this time that's not being tracked, right? It's super easy, right?
Hmm.
Selling it was not an issue at all, right? It's really the implementation, right? Because the user is like, well, why would I want to start like using this thing that's going to tell if I'm late to work, or
Yeah.
like this is like there's like almost zero incentive for them like to um, I don't know how design thinking helps this, but but ultimately, right? What I will do is like I'll look for incentives for the user as well, and see like how what kind of problems would they potentially have that you could solve for, right?
Right.
So like in this case, like for timekeeping, like a timekeeping software, is that those guys would also would how I would sell it typically would be like, hey, well, like when you worked overtime, before, sometimes the manager wouldn't pay you the overtime and just like let you off early like the next day or something, right? To
Yeah.
like make up for the extra overtime that you do. Well, now with the timekeeping system, like they're gonna know they won't be able to avoid paying you the overtime because you worked more than 8 hours. They're gonna know right away, and you'll get your overtime check, regardless. Like you won't just get made up for it, like with extra time off the next day or something like that, right? So
Right.
like so you'll have a better tracking of like your overtime pay. But realistically, that didn't maybe hit all the users, right? Like it's somebody who comes into work every day and doesn't work any overtime, like there's like less incentive, potentially for them. But hey, it's just those are the times that you the thing about design thinking, right? Design thinking is like really that product is supposed to be user centered, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah. Not customer
so
centric, user
you
centric.
shouldn't, yeah, so you shouldn't typically run into if you leverage your user design thinking, then you wouldn't have this scenario most of the time,
Right.
right? I think a lot of the times those kinds of scenarios will happen in business because the the buyer is not the user, right? Like the buyer of the software isn't maybe the user, and so you have to kind of think through, um, and then that's where user design thinking comes in, right? It's like maybe no one's ever interviewed the user, right? Like maybe they don't know what their problems are, so let's talk to them about what their problems are, and then leverage design thinking to see like how can we come up with solutions that are easier for them. Like
Yeah.
sometimes too, like sometimes people are like super busy, right? And
Hmm.
they're like maybe the tool is better. So like to your lucite or Luddite analogy, sometimes it's just like I don't want to learn this, right?
Yeah.
Like it's like I don't have time, right?
Hmm.
So, the thing about design thinking is that you should understand that feedback, and then the solution doesn't have to be a software, like, maybe it's just learning and development, right? And say like, "Hey, like, we're gonna give you this course, and you're gonna learn how to do this," and, like, and then that's the way that you're gonna learn how, yeah, like, you're gonna be able to do this, like, quickly, right? Like, so, yeah. I
Sometimes. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I mean, I would say there's probably other examples of, like, where this is, like, like, where some of these things, some products that, not all products that get created are always thought of, like, for all of the users,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, even if you think of, like, one of the most successful, like, iPhones, right? Super successful product, right? But, like, to somebody who's, like, seeing impaired, like, not having haptic buttons is horrible, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, it's like you can't you it's like, "Oh, well, now I can't, like, feel, like, the numbers to, like, dial my friend," like, so, like, so I think I think you're, with the design thing, you're focusing on a certain, segment of the users,
Mm.
and you're really kinda, so you may, it probably is good to probably, like, expand your user base to everyone maybe at some point, and say, like, "Alright, who am I, like, leaving out because of the bias," is, like, that you even brought up earlier, right? Like, maybe I'm only selecting people that I like, or something like that, or, like, conform to my thinking already,
Yeah.
so
You know what would be really cool if screens for the smartphones can come in such a way that they can sort of change their shape and they can actually have the braille coming out. People would, I don't know if that's possible or not. That's some material science innovation needed, but that would be nice. Okay, so ideate, and then it was prototype and then test.
yes,
I'm
yeah.
assuming I'm assuming that after ideate, prototyping, by the end of prototyping, that is the solution. That's you've narrowed down on.
Yeah, yeah, your
Okay.
you should have some solutions at the prototyping, right, that you're
Hmm.
having. The lower the fidelity, the faster you can get it to the users, the better, right? So that you can start getting the results from the testing. Now, I mean, even to your point about the testing, so, like, one thing you definitely, and my suggestion on the testing, is that you do have to, like, really understand your own biases, and not fall into the trap of confirmation bias, right?
Right.
Like, because if you've had a bunch of people working, like, and you actually, I think this actually happens even more in design sprints than it does. Well, I think it happens all the time, but, like, like, you have to be willing to say, like, "Hey, what we're trying may not work," right?
Hmm.
Like, and you have to be able to say that without getting repercussions from, like, management later, right?
Hmm.
Like, this is a risk that we're all taking, right? Like, to do this, right? Like, I mean, in the case of, like, prototyping with A/B testing, like, sometimes that sometimes you can avoid that, right? Because you can say, like, "Hey, look, we A/B tested this and it didn't work at all," right? Like, we need, so, like, we saved on spending the actual, like, development time and cost to, like, get it done.
Hmm.
But I would say that, like, and this is why I say I think sometimes it happens more in design sprints, like, is because, like, typically you have, like, management, you have a bunch of people, like, high up people trying to do this, and, like, you'll have the user, and so maybe you're testing, like, maybe you're paying them, or, so it's like there's a lot of money within those 2 weeks that's, like, getting, like, used, and so by the end, you'll be like, "Oh, well, it didn't work," and then you'll just be like, "Oh, well, they pressed on this button more than the other, so, like, it's working," right? And, like, you'll fall victim to, like, your confirmation bias, and you'll not really look at it, unbiased, to see, like, oh, is it actually doing what you expected, right?
Yeah,
um
yeah. I think there's one more scenario where you can fall victim to the executives who kind of want it to work, and they won't say it, they'd wink it to you, and then you'd be like, going against your intuition, you'll be like, ah, it works, and then if it fails, then you're on the chopping block. So that becomes a problem.
Yeah, 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 and that's why I mean, I think just being clear about that, like, at the front, right? And
Yeah.
saying, like, "Hey, we're testing for this, we're trying to get that. If it doesn't work, like this is a contingency that we're gonna have, right? We know we're spending this much money
Hmm.
to make this happen, you know, like in this much time to see if this works. But at the end of the day, you know, none of this could, you know, potentially work, you know, and that and really having that that back, you know, the backing to be like, okay, yeah.
So just, I mean, I want some more clarity here. So when you say work, what is the definition of done over here? So when does it pass prototyping as
So
opposed
yeah,
to
so
fail?
you're defining your metrics for success, right?
Okay.
So like so you know, if you so in the case of like if you have the A/B testing, right, then it's like you'll probably implement it after the A/B test has reached statistical significance, and then you implement it. I do think there is the idea that you have to come back later, like, you know, 6 months later and say like, hey, is that still providing the metric? Because usually right after you implement something, it might be working well, but like, you know, if you don't come back later, then sometimes it won't be working that well. Like,
Right.
and I found scenarios like that too, right? Where like the first month, like, you know, maybe kind of to your point about like correlation, right? Like, yeah, revenue's up, but it's like we have marketing dollars that are over it, right? And then like 3 months later, you go back and you're like, oh well, it's like the revenue seems to like not be like going up anymore for like at the same rate that it was before.
Yeah.
Like it shouldn't be that much of a difference now that the marketing dollars are down, you know. And then, you know, I went talked to sales and they're like, oh yeah, well like we have no incentive to do that because like that's a cheaper product. So like, you know, our ours is off of like, you know, the max the like our commission, you know, we want to have a higher product. So then they have no incentive. So then you have to go back and be like, hey, sales, like let's redo how we do our sales so that like they're selling this again, you know, like and so that they understand like this is an incentive for us. So this is a similar case of this like of like the user not being necessarily the same as the customer, right? Like
Right. Right.
because our sales department is the user, right, of the product, like or the product per se, but they weren't selling it the same way because, like, oh, it's like it made more profit for the company as a whole, but it didn't make more profit for the individual salesperson. So it's like you have to go back and say like, hey, well, like let's change our commission structure to like make sure that SaaS makes you more money than like on premise, or like you know like make sure that this has got you know more money than the other product, right? Like even though it costs less to the user, you know,
Right.
stuff.
Okay. So some rapid fire questions, and
Sure.
some of them will be tangential, but I want to start with a cynical question first. Now, how much of this is essentially drawing an arbitrary line in the sand, but then using a process to sort of justify those lines in the sand, as opposed to like a perfect formula in physics, which will yield a certain result? What would you say to somebody who attacks it with this line of thought?
I think it probably is the first one, right? I think it is kind of it's not necessarily like it's a framework for
Hmm.
thinking, not necessarily like an algebra for thinking, right?
Okay.
Like there's not like set rules like that you could say like, oh, this is like how I should do it. I think just understanding that like that these are the phases and that we should be thinking about those things like
Hmm.
before we create a solution like gives you just some structure to like how to approach, you know.
So since psychology and sociology are not like exact sciences, they're human sciences, and we can try and become exact, but we don't want to like impose exactness on it. I'm assuming this is derived from that, a huge portion of it anyway. So it'll have its
Yeah, I
limitations.
mean, I think it's like it came out of the, you know, I think ultimately it came out of the design idea, right? And so like I think there is some or design principles, right?
Right.
So like I think in general, right? Like design isn't an exact science either, right? Like
Hmm.
it's it's got it's got like some subjectiveness like
Right.
built into it, right? You know,
Right.
like so, you know, I mean, I think there is like I don't I think I've been kind of like what interests me is it's interesting because some of the design things that I'm interested in are really much more around like the technical aspects of it and stuff like that. But it's like it's like it doesn't matter how much of the technical aspects you kind of know if it doesn't solve the problem for like
Right.
what you're designing for,
Right.
you know?
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, you can nerd out, and that's fine if that's the aim, but it's not solving the problem because that's yeah. Yeah.
And because like even like well, I think like even some of those like wheel of emotions, right? Like I can look at it
Mm,
like it's a like it's like it is like it is an exact science, but it's not, right?
mm,
Like I can't tell like what I mean, I can get a gauge of what will excite the customer, but like I always feel like some of those things like that try to like make a science out of it, like Kano or whatever. Like,
yeah.
like
Yeah.
I don't necessarily think that they work that great. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. So I guess those are good models to start off with if you really don't know what the landscape is, but you want to develop an intuition by using them more and more to figure out when to deviate, like, jazz from classical music.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's really it. Yeah, I think that's yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think there is an art to product management and there's art to design that, like just like how we're talking about like if you had like yeah, if you went with the iPhone or something, right? Like or maybe some, some other super like disruptive technology, like maybe you wouldn't have ended up with what you had you like, been like very like, oh well, no user asked for like, a
Yeah.
full touch, right? Like or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, I mean, the famous line by, but I don't know if he actually said it, but it's attributed to him, and I've said it on multiple podcasts. I think Henry Ford's is like, if I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So,
Right.
and I don't want faster horses. I want faster cars. So that's the difference here. Okay, now can this be used? Do you think this methodology or this framework is going to be beneficial in public sector service delivery? Um,
Oh, for sure, for
okay.
sure.
And
Yeah,
policy
yeah. I
making as
mean,
well?
what's that?
Policy making as well?
I
Uh,
think so. I mean,
okay.
I think so in the sense of like, I mean, obviously like everything can be used for, good or any tool can be used for
Yeah.
good or bad, right? But I mean, I think if you're really looking for policy that's like helping the user, then sure, like, that's definitely necessary, right? Like, and I think it would help, right? Like,
Okay.
yeah.
So you would endorse it if somebody wants to try
I
it.
would, I would. I mean, but like I'm saying, like it's like like you know, behavioral economics, right? Like a lot of like public sectors are using that now, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
and it's kind of like yeah, that could be used for nefarious purposes just
Yeah.
as much as it could be used for the good of the public, right? So it's
Yeah.
like, is it automatically signing you up for your 401k or your IRA and in the case of the public sector, 403 or whatever, um, then probably it's good. It's good, tool to use. But like, if you're using it to like, I don't know, like get some weird agenda that the
Yeah.
public's not really interested in, like that some special interest is interested in, then it's
I
probably
think a
not.
bigger problem, this is just my opinion, and I guess it's getting influenced by Peter Thiel, is because the bigger problem here is not like they'll use it for nefarious purposes. It just becomes, instead of a tool of use, it becomes a tool of excuse. So, oh, it didn't work because, they just keep talking about the jargon, and then nobody really thinks about the outcome, and everything can be bastardized in any way. So that's what I worry about. So yeah, okay, and okay, last question. Um, Agile development places a lot of emphasis on, well, agility and on changing and breaking and all of these things. Now, design, on the other hand, the name implies that it is like basically, well, it's planning. I don't want to call it central planning like Soviet Union, but it's planning. So, what's the tension over here? Like, while you are actually building the product, you figure out that we really need to go back, and we cannot be compliant to the prototype. What happens then?
I actually don't find that there's a tension
Okay.
between the two. Because I think that design thinking should be used in agile because I mean, when you write a user story, right, you're typically supposed to write it from the perspective of the user, right?
Right.
And say
Right.
like as a persona. And so I mean, really understanding and empathizing with that persona
Mm,
should encapsulate like how you and it's really like I was saying, like I think a sprint really is just a small implementation of design thinking, right?
right.
In my mind, right? Like every sprint is like a small section of like every sprint I'm coming up with a prototype for the user to test, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think personally, I don't think they're at odds with each other. I think they support each other, right? Because I don't think you're designing it so much that you're deviating from the problems of the user that you're trying to solve, which is what you're trying to do with the user story that you're trying to come up with,
Right.
in a sprint. So I don't think there's that much. I mean, I I know what you're saying in the sense of like design, like maybe when I'm designing something, like maybe there's certain rules inside like the typeface or things like that or
Yeah.
limitations. And but I think that though even those like let's just talk about typeface. Like even if you come up with typeface, like part of the reasoning you want like like there's rules inside like how long the T is and how long how long the crossbar on the T is because they like when but it's from the user perspective that oh like if I didn't make the middle of the E slightly skinnier than the rest of the E, it would look like they were disproportionate, right?
Yeah.
Like so I mean I think ultimately you still have at the base the user even when you have design limitations or restrictions that you're trying to have, right? Now,
Mm,
if you're just arbitrarily like, if you just have like, somebody who's just like a control freak and is like, oh well, this is like how it should be, then like, I think maybe there's a tension there, right? And Steve Jobs might be,
yep.
simple there, but like, like I think I think they're trying to work around that, right? But like, you
Right.
know.
Okay. Perfect. So this was great. Do you have any parting thoughts?
No, I think that's it. I think that's it. That was good. Yeah.
That was good. All right. Folks, thank you. See you in the next episode. Ashish and I are going to have a little chat now. Bye bye.